Why would the largest railroad in America keep ordering brand new locomotives while 600 perfectly good ones sit idle? Hundreds of engines, each worth millions of dollars, lined up motionless in the Arizona desert, baking under the sun, while Union Pacific keeps placing fresh orders worth billions more. It looks like corporate madness or staggering waste, but the real answer is far more unsettling than either. Because what's happening on that 3-mile stretch of desert track reveals how the American rail industry actually works and what it's willing to sacrifice to keep working that way. This 3-mile stretch of former mainline track, cut off from the active rail network east of Interstate 10, serves as a silent storage yard. These yellow SD70 and ES44 AC locomotives are modern heavy-haul workhorses, highly valuable assets parked far from any scrapyard. Each unit contains sophisticated electronics, massive diesel engines, and heavy-duty traction motors with an original market value of $1 to $3 million. Leaving hundreds of these active machines in the southern Arizona sun represents a sidelined investment of nearly $500 million. The low humidity of the desert protects the steel and internal components from rust, keeping maintenance costs low while the units sit idle. Union Pacific crews regularly inspect and maintain the fleet, keeping the engines operational and ready for deployment. The sight of millions of dollars in functional horsepower sitting idle while new locomotives are purchased raises direct questions about corporate spending. A precise, calculated strategy governs this desert lineup. Union Pacific operates as the largest freight railroad in the United States, controlling over 32,000 miles of track across 23 states and moving 1/5 of the nation's rail cargo. When a network of this scale parks hundreds of operational, multi-million-dollar engines while simultaneously writing billion-dollar checks for new power, the decision ripples across the entire American supply chain. This is a deliberate, structural choice. The coexistence of active buying and inactive inventory serves as a primary entry point into the highly pressurized business logic of modern transportation. What looks like massive corporate waste actually reflects a complex calculus of asset management, federal regulation, and Wall Street performance targets. The parked locomotives in Arizona represent a calculated strategy that has changed how railroads move goods across the continent. To find out why these machines remain silent, the investigation must look past the desert tracks and into the balance sheets, operating models, and legal mandates that govern the modern rail industry. Selecting the arid expanse of southern Arizona is not a matter of convenience, but of chemistry. Near Tucson, the desert offers an environment where relative humidity regularly drops into the single digits. This dry air creates a natural preservation chamber, arresting the oxidation process that typically degrades heavy steel and sensitive electrical components. On these remote, inactive sidings, locomotives can sit for years with minimal deterioration. The vast empty space provides the physical room needed to park miles of heavy machinery without disrupting active freight corridors. What appears to be an eerie train graveyard is actually a highly functional asset reservoir, where the environment itself serves as a low-cost, open-air warehouse. Here, geography matches corporate logistics, transforming a barren desert into a permanent piece of the railroad's infrastructure. A railroad operating 32,000 route miles across 23 states functions as a critical artery of national commerce, far outgrowing the bounds of a typical private business. Every day, the trains moving along this network carry the raw materials of the American economy: grain for food supplies, coal for power grids, and shipping containers filled with consumer goods. Because Union Pacific moves 20% of all domestic rail cargo, its internal equipment decisions dictate the speed of the entire supply chain. A shortage of pulling power can stall factories, empty store shelves, and drive up prices. Parking hundreds of functional locomotives while buying new ones directly affects the cost and speed of moving goods across the continent. Because of this scale, the decisions made in Omaha boardrooms regarding fleet availability shift a private asset calculation into a matter of public interest. These lines of yellow steel stretching across the desert are not a collection of worn-out junk awaiting the cutting torch. Despite their silent, sun-baked appearance, these locomotives are not dead scrap. Many of the engines parked on these sidings are relatively modern mainline models, primarily SD70s and ES44ACs, built in the late 1990s and in the 2000s. These are the same heavy-haul workhorses that pulled high-priority freight across the country just a short time ago, and they remain fully operational. Union Pacific does not classify them as retired or written off. Instead, they are officially cataloged as idle, active assets. Maintenance crews regularly cycle through these storage lines, inspecting the engines, performing basic upkeep, and keeping their mechanical systems in a state of constant readiness. They are preserved, protected, and fully capable of pulling freight. This reality reframes the mystery. If these multi-million-dollar machines are completely functional and actively maintained, the question is no longer why they were discarded, but why a major railroad has spent so much effort keeping them switched off. The first concrete answer to why these locomotives were sidelined lies in a structural operational shift that redefined North American railroading. On October 1, 2018, Union Pacific launched its Unified Plan 2020. This initiative brought the formal adoption of Precision Scheduled Railroading, or PSR, a freight transport model pioneered by legendary rail executive Hunter Harrison and quickly adopted by nearly every major carrier on the continent. Before this shift, railroads typically operated under a blend and balance system, holding trains in yards until enough cargo arrived to justify dispatching a new crew and locomotive consist. PSR inverted this entire logic. Instead of scheduling movements around whole trains, the model schedules the movement of individual rail cars on a strict, fixed timetable. If a scheduled train is set to depart at noon, it departs at noon, regardless of how many cars are attached. This change forced the railroad to focus on leaner asset use, stripping out any equipment that did not directly serve the scheduled timetables. To make this strict scheduling profitable, the railroad consolidated its network, closed complex classification yards, and began assembling exceptionally long, heavy trains. The primary goal was to drastically reduce the number of daily train starts, the actual departures of trains, from their origin terminals. By combining multiple smaller trains into single massive consists, Union Pacific could move the exact same volume of cargo with far fewer total runs. The physical evidence of this strategy shows up clearly in the operating metrics. In May 2018, just before the rollout of the Unified Plan, the average length of a Union Pacific freight train stood at 5,741 feet. By May 2019, only 1 year into the new operating model, the average train length had surged to 6,008 feet. This 267-foot increase across thousands of daily runs had an immediate, compounding effect on the railroad's equipment requirements. A single train measuring over a mile long requires fewer crews, fewer dispatch windows, and critically, fewer active locomotives than 2 shorter trains carrying the same tonnage. By maximizing the pulling power of the active fleet, the railroad generated massive hauling capacity without needing as many physical machines on the line. The operational result was swift. Daily locomotive demand plummeted across the 32,000-mile network. Suddenly, hundreds of high-horsepower, multi-million-dollar diesel engines that were vital to daily operations under the old model became entirely redundant. These machines remained mechanically sound and fully operational, but the new system left them with no scheduled runs. They had become victims of their own operating model's productivity. Rather than keeping these excess assets on active sidings where they would clog terminal yards and require daily upkeep, the railroad needed a place to store them cheaply and safely. The operational math of precision-scheduled railroading directly generated the massive equipment surplus. This asset-light strategy transformed active, capital-intensive workhorses into silent inventory, paving the direct path from busy freight yards to the remote desert tracts of Arizona. This apparent inventory waste is actually the centerpiece of a deliberate, multi-horizon fleet strategy. Union Pacific management balances short-term operational fluctuations against long-term capital horizons, creating a calculated system of planned coexistence. The decision to order brand new power, while hundreds of existing engines sit idle in the desert, reflects a coordinated effort to manage the active fleet over several decades. This dual approach rests on three distinct factors that govern the modern railroad. First, the financial reality of rebuilding older frames rather than purchasing expensive new ones. Second, the escalating pressure of federal and state environmental mandates. And third, the operational necessity of maintaining a massive, readily deployable reserve to absorb sudden, unpredictable surges in national freight demand. Instead of buying entirely new locomotives to replace the stored fleet, Union Pacific calculates the lifetime value of its existing hardware. In July 2022, the railroad finalized an agreement with manufacturer Wabtec, committing over $1 billion to modernize 600 older locomotives. This program targets the core of the railroad's fleet renewal strategy, treating old locomotives as valuable foundations for upgrades rather than scrap. Rebuilding an existing locomotive costs roughly $1.7 million per unit, compared to upwards of $4 million for a brand new machine. This stark price difference transforms the rebuild versus replace decision from a simple purchase into a complex portfolio strategy. Under this approach, the railroad retains the heavy steel frame, the wheels, and the massive engine block, but completely replaces the outdated internal systems. Wabtec acts as the technical partner in this process, stripping legacy units down to their frames and installing advanced propulsion electronics, modular control systems, and upgraded diagnostic software. These modernized digital systems continuously track engine performance, catching mechanical issues before they cause a breakdown on the main line. This preventive capability dramatically reduces unscheduled maintenance and lowers overall running costs, strengthening the business case for keeping existing frames on the active registry. The upgrades also deliver up to an 18% improvement in fuel efficiency, making these rebuilt units competitive with anything coming off the factory floor. By recycling 70,000 tons of steel from original frames and inserting modern internal machinery, Union Pacific secures a modernized fleet at a fraction of the cost of new equipment. This technical overhaul explains why the railroad keeps hundreds of older engines on its books. Rather than wasting capital on new purchases, the railroad uses its desert storage as a staging ground, systematically drawing from this silent reserve to build a more efficient, cost-effective network. The Environmental Protection Agency set the baseline by introducing Tier 4 emission standards in 2015. These rules forced manufacturers to redesign diesel engines, requiring ultra-low sulfur fuel and advanced exhaust after-treatment to slash particulate emissions and nitrogen oxide levels. But the most severe pressure came from California. In April 2023, the California Air Resources Board enacted its in-use locomotive regulation, creating a strict compliance timeline that bypasses traditional fleet replacement schedules. Railroads must submit their first detailed emissions reports to California regulators by July 1, 2026. This administrative milestone leads directly to a hard operational deadline on January 1, 2030, when the state will officially ban any locomotive older than 23 years from operating within its borders. 5 years after that, In 2035, California mandates that all line-haul locomotives running through the state must transition entirely to zero-emission technology. These legal dates directly target the silent fleet parked in the Arizona desert. Many of these stored SD-70 and ES-44 AC locomotives were built in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Under the new guidelines, these perfectly functional machines will become legally unusable in California by the end of the decade. Because Union Pacific's network heavily relies on transcontinental corridors ending at the ports of Los Angeles and Oakland, California's rules effectively set the standard for the entire Western fleet. Locomotives cannot easily be isolated from the rest of the network without disrupting complex transcontinental schedules. Lower emission power has transitioned from an environmental goal into an absolute planning requirement. Railroad executives must balance their fleet books, not against mechanical wear, but against a rigid regulatory calendar, leaving hundreds of operational engines sidelined simply because their birth years make them illegal to run. The decision to hold hundreds of functional locomotives in the desert rests on a fundamental law of freight transportation. Demand is never constant. Freight rail is highly cyclical, shifting rapidly with seasonal grain harvests, winter energy demands, and sudden import surges at coastal ports. In this volatile environment, maintaining a tight, bare minimum fleet is a recipe for system-wide failure. Union Pacific treats these stored engines as a strategic reserve, an active backup force that can be reactivated and deployed within days when shipment volumes spike. If a sudden supply chain bottleneck occurs, or a harsh winter slows transit speeds across the northern corridors, the railroad can draw directly from its Arizona storage lines. Having these units ready to run prevents localized delays from cascading into national log jams. While the railroad continues to place orders for new locomotives to secure its long-term baseline capability, the desert fleet acts as a shock absorber for the present. Keeping these assets in a state of preserved readiness is far more cost-effective than purchasing brand-new locomotives to handle temporary traffic spikes. This reserve capacity allows Union Pacific to scale its operations up or down without committing massive capital to permanent fleet expansions. In the math of modern railroading, an idle locomotive is not necessarily a wasted asset. It is paid-for horsepower, waiting silently in the dry heat until the next shift in the global economy calls it back to the main line. The balance sheet is where this apparent logistical waste becomes corporate strategy. A single locomotive rebuild under the Wabtec program costs Union Pacific approximately $1.7 million. In contrast, acquiring a brand new Tier 4 diesel locomotive requires a capital outlay of roughly $2 to $4 million. Over a fleet of hundreds of units, this price gap represents billions of dollars in saved capital. By modernizing stored units instead of purchasing new ones, the railroad extracts modern performance at a steep discount. But the financial logic runs deeper than simple unit costs. Under federal tax guidelines and corporate accounting rules, locomotives are capital assets depreciated over a multi-year schedule. If Union Pacific were to scrap these stored engines immediately, it would be forced to write off their remaining book value, triggering a massive, immediate loss recognition event on its financial statements. By keeping the locomotives in desert storage, the railroad continues to record gradual, predictable depreciation while keeping the assets on its books. This accounting treatment protects quarterly earnings from sudden write-downs and preserves a potential tax shield. A railroad cannot simply buy locomotives on demand when shipping volumes rise. Manufacturer lead times for a mainline locomotive order typically range from 18 to 36 months, with builders like Progress Rail and Wabtec managing deep production backlogs. Because of these multi-year delays, Union Pacific must place orders for next-generation technology years before it is actually needed on the tracks. This creates a structural overlap where new orders must be finalized even as hundreds of older, fully functional engines are held in reserve. On paper, this simultaneous buying and storing is not a contradiction. It is a highly rational hedge against long supply chains, tax penalties, and the unpredictable peaks of global freight demand. The corporate math that keeps engines silent in the desert translates directly to empty lockers in the rail yards. To achieve these financial metrics, Union Pacific cut between 450 and 500 positions, putting crews on furlough as operations leaned out. For the workers left behind, the daily reality of railroading grew more demanding. Under the scheduled freight model, fewer people are required to run longer, heavier trains over the same vast distances. Union representatives from SMART TD and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen warn that these cuts stretch staff to their limits, raising concerns over safety and fatigue. With fewer crews available, there is no safety net when the unexpected occurs. This lack of operational margin appears quickly on the main lines. When a 3-mile-long train experiences a mechanical breakdown, or a crew runs out of legally allowed service hours, the entire corridor grinds to a halt. In earlier years, standby locomotives and extra crews could resolve these bottlenecks within hours. Now, because the system runs with minimal spare parts and personnel, localized delays spread across multiple states. Shippers, the businesses relying on the railroad to move grain, chemicals, and consumer goods, face unpredictable arrival times and mounting delays. The Surface Transportation Board has tracked these service complaints, noting that the push for lean assets has compromised overall dependability. The fallout extends past the shippers to the communities along the tracks. Towns like Benson and Marana see their local economies quiet down as yard activity drops, while giant trains frequently block road crossings for hours, cutting off emergency vehicles and dividing neighborhoods. The silent engines in the desert do not just represent saved capital. They stand for a system running with almost no room for error, where the price of keeping the balance sheet clean is paid in missed deliveries, exhausted crews, and fractured local infrastructure. This operational template does not belong to Union Pacific alone. Across the North American rail network, competing Class I railroads have adopted the exact same operating model, producing identical silent fleets in quiet yards. The decisions made in Omaha mirror strategies executed in Jacksonville and Atlanta. This systemic behavior demonstrates that the Arizona Desert Fleet is not a corporate anomaly, but the standard playbook for modern railroading. Look at CSX Transportation. Operating across the eastern United States, CSX placed approximately 600 locomotives into long-term storage. This sidelined force represented roughly 16% of its entire 3,800-unit fleet. At the same time, Norfolk Southern sidelined about 400 of its own locomotives, representing 11% of its active roster. For both carriers, hundreds of millions of dollars in functional hauling power was systematically turned off, parked, and left on storage tracks. Just like Union Pacific, these competitors did not stop purchasing new equipment when they parked their existing engines. The same financial and strategic pattern occurred. Norfolk Southern, even with 400 units sitting idle, finalized orders for 40 brand new ES44AC locomotives for delivery in 2026. This parallel behavior across the entire rail sector proves that the desert storage lines are not a corporate miscalculation or an isolated mistake. They represent a shared industry priority. The force driving this sector-wide strategy is the universal adoption of scheduled railroading. 6 of the 7 Class I railroads in the United States converted to this asset-light system. By consolidating classification yards and assembling longer, heavier trains, every major carrier stripped daily train starts from their schedules. When railroads run trains that span miles in length, they require fewer physical locomotives to move the same tonnage. The immediate result across the entire industry was a sudden, massive surplus of motive power. But a lean, active fleet leaves no safety margin for seasonal shipping spikes, agricultural harvests, or severe weather. To solve this, the major railroads created their own strategic reserve pools. The parked engines are not destined for the scrap heap. They are maintained as standby capital assets. This keeps them on the corporate books, allowing railroads to spread out depreciation costs and avoid immediate financial losses from write-offs. Retaining these units in a state of preserved readiness provides a buffer to reactivate power when shipping volumes rise. Meanwhile, the pressure of state and federal environmental guidelines forces these same companies to invest in cleaner technology. Railroads cannot rely solely on their older stored fleets to meet future standards. They must order next-generation platforms years in advance because of multi-year manufacturer lead times. This lag creates the visible contradiction of new machines arriving at rail yards, while hundreds of older functional units remain parked in storage. The silent rows of yellow engines in the Arizona desert are a visible monument to a modern transportation strategy that favors asset-light balance sheets over operational redundancy. Across the entire rail network, the industry has traded excess physical capacity for financial efficiency, betting that a lean, highly optimized system can withstand the volatile demands of the American supply chain. The rows of silent locomotives resting in the dry desert heat represent a calculated corporate wager. By stripping spare physical capacity out of the daily operating schedule, the railroad has constructed a system designed to run at the lowest possible operating cost during normal conditions. This model delivers precisely what Wall Street demands: lower operating ratios, reduced capital expenditures, and higher immediate returns. But this financial streamlining changes the fundamental nature of the network. A system running with minimal active equipment and reduced crew levels has very little ability to absorb disruptions. When a winter storm freezes a mountain pass, or a sudden harvest creates a surge in shipping demand, there are no idle locomotives sitting ready in local yards to handle the load. The spare horsepower is parked hundreds of miles away in Arizona, requiring days to reactivate and deploy. This creates a stark operational trade-off. The same corporate design that saves billions of dollars in capital costs also narrows the margin for error on the main line. It exchanges physical resilience for balance sheet liquidity. What looks like a brilliant strategy of lean asset management during stable economic periods can quickly transform into a fragile bottleneck when real-world disruptions strike. The silent fleet in the desert stands as a monument to this unresolved dilemma, leaving a stark question for the national supply chain. Has this modern corporate strategy made the nation's transport network stronger, or has it simply left it more brittle beneath the surface? Today, those silent lines in the desert are not a monument to waste, but the blueprint of modern precision railroading. By stripping the system to its bare bones, Union Pacific has secured record margins. Yet, as global supply chains demand greater resilience, a deeper question emerges: has this relentless drive for efficiency built a stronger, smarter network, or one that is dangerously brittle beneath the surface? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.